Welcome to Conversations with Educators, where we bring educators from across the country to talk about topics like college and career readiness, graduation tracking, teacher growth, assessment coordination, and more. Let's get started.
All right. Well, today's session is called Taming the End of the Year Staff Evaluation Beast. And I am really excited that we are able to have Brian Johnson with us. He is with the Danielson Group. And Brian, I'm going to let you go ahead and share a little bit about yourself.
Hi, welcome. It's good to see you all. I'm Brian Johnson. I'm the Director of Learning Design and Development at the Danielson Group, and I've been with the Danielson Group for about 8 years. And a part of my role is I help design content, facilitate conversations with our district leaders, ensure that strategic plans are being met using the framework and also with a lens through equity and access and social emotional learning, all the things that we hope that our students are getting in schools. We also try to make sure that we're embedding that in any kind of adult learning at the Danielson Group.
Uh, yes, we're so glad that you're here with us today, Brian. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Okay, so we're gonna talk about a few different things today on our agenda. We have the first topic is what are those three biggest time wasters? What is it that during this evaluation process, especially as we get close to the summative evaluation discussions, what are some of those time wasters, Brian, that you think that we need to consider?
Absolutely. And I think I'll use the word of ways that we can try to streamline than, wasting time because if you're an administrator and you're mulling through, it's probably is good time use, but time is always of the essence. And I think one thing that really is helpful in terms of kind of streamlining processes is thinking about the framework not necessarily as every single component. And our philosophy is that there are certain power components or components that are high leverage that will also kind of touch and interlock with other components. So I always urge our administrators and our observers to think about in the total framework, what are 4 to 5 components that would be sort of big bucket, if you will, and under those buckets, you can kind of put in evidence and other supporting components. So essentially, we always get asked, the framework feels overwhelming and there are so many components and so many elements of success. And I say, there are. Because again, the evaluation tool or the framework was really used for coaching and support. So there will be some overlap and really thinking about those pieces of evidence that you've collected over the course of the year. What are those pieces that serve multiple components or those components that align to either your school or your district initiatives? And I think that's a good starting point where it's sort of truncating the framework to work closer toward the purposes and the initiatives of the schools and districts. So I think that's one time saver instead of kind of mulling and looking over so many pieces of evidence, trying to align them to every single component or element of success. Think about it in a kind of big picture way.
Yeah. And some of those big buckets, I know, the planning component in 1B would be one area. What are some of those big bucket areas that we could look for that documentation and focus?
Thanks, Kim. Absolutely. And I think in domain one, knowing and valuing students, to me, that is something that is infused throughout every domain of the framework. So although we house it in domain one around planning and preparation, because it does take a little bit more of a front-loaded kind of mindset to say, what are the skill sets of my students? What are the learning differences of my students? What are the cultural competencies that I need to see? How can I see that in learning environment? In learning experiences and ultimately in the way that we are developing ourselves. I think in domain two, I would say fostering a culture for learning in cultivating respectful and affirming environments. If you don't have those two critical components, it's really hard to transverse and amplify a classroom that feels warm and inviting. I also would say in domains 3C, engaging students in learning. Oftentimes people say that, or if you've had Danielson training, people say that it is the heart of the framework, and we totally believe that it is the heart of the framework because when we think about rich learning experiences, critical thinking, pacing, structure of sort of the learning outcomes for students, it immediately goes back to domain 1. And some of those
Mhm.
other pieces are if I have planned a very rich learning experience, it probably also means that I know how to apply knowledge of my content and pedagogy. It means that I've probably been thinking very strategically about my students. It means that for every individual students, I'm thinking about the outcomes or knowing that I have some students that might be striving in a certain objective or aim. I know that I have students that are going to exceed and master that skill very quickly. Um, and I think also in domain 4, I would focus on engaging in reflective practice. We don't spend enough time giving teachers time to sit back and think about how did their instruction play out that day or over the course of the week? Or, I think a lot for our new teachers of the incremental growth that might be hard for them to see on a weekly or daily basis. But as the observer, we're seeing tremendous growth in their practice. Um, and again, those are just some of my suggestions. And I think that what I love about the framework is you could potentially pick any component as your sort of main focus or your power component. But I think those are ones that in our research and working in schools, they are really robust in terms of the dialogue, conversation, in ways that we see that when we focus and put attention on those components, we see tremendous growth in student success and also in teacher instruction and pedagogy.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more on that. And I think that you highlighted the value in those post conferences for observations and using that reflection and looking at how the engagement of students is incorporated into the instruction. And I think a lot of times administrators, they get to that summative and they're looking at those scores on the evaluation, and it's really important to zone in on what is the most critical piece here, and setting up that summative conference to be a true reflection for the teacher and the administrator on feedback, and it helps kind of set the course for the following year. So um, that leads us right into how do you see streamlining that documentation and reporting? What are some tips that you have for helping and streamline? I know you mentioned, looking at the big buckets and setting your priorities there, but what would you do as far as streamlining?
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes into not just in the end of year, but this is an ongoing process. When we think about maintaining accurate records, we have to think about what are the systems that work for each person. So, I might be much more of a low-tech person. So I may need the post-it note where someone else is using, Google or Google Reminders. And I think people have to be honest with themselves of like, what is the system that will work for them, that will keep them on track so that the system has to work or it's not a system. And I think a part of that is in proper documentation. And I think around, what are the things that you're requesting of teachers to showcase in terms of these kind of components? So, whether that's a folder that is processing charts, or it is exemplar lesson plans, or it might be some feedback that you're giving students that I think we have to be a little bit more strategic as administrators and those that are sort of, I call it in the back end of, platforms, and letting the technology work for them and being able to say, you can take a picture of said document and it can go immediately to a file that I know it's going to be there. So when it's time for me to really do a deep analysis of whether it's one teacher or 30 teachers or my whole school, I already have the data collection there versus, this happens a lot, Kim, it's like, uh-oh, we're in March, we're about to hit testing, and then it's end of year, and then it's graduation, and then it's, the step up ceremonies that sometimes there isn't enough time to collect the pieces that you might have done earlier. So I really try to uh, tell people, think really about being proactive and, putting in the reminders in your phone or when you might be doing even some school, walkthroughs or calibrations around your school halls, take the pictures of that document, send yourself an email, remind yourself of these are practices or skills that I want to make sure that I'm documenting because it's going to help me in the long term, in the long end, when I'm really trying to collect so much information. Um, and I think that it's sort of thing is the same advice we would give to teachers, right? So like
Mhm.
as you are executing a lesson, write down a note about the adjustments or the changes or the thing that went really well so that you're not going back and looking at, 6 months later of, wait, how did that lesson go? I don't really remember. I might have one piece of student work. Um, and I feel like it's so much easier said than done, but there's this philosophy I heard about like habit stacking. And when you're able to kind of habit stack, things become more intuitive. And I think we should, again, allow, like education advanced platforms to do some of that heavy lifting for us, and let it become part of a really natural process of giving feedback, receiving feedback, analyzing the data that I've collected, looking at the evidence that I have across the board, because I think the uh, one of the more critical things that an administrator can do is think about that bird's eye view, and there aren't that many in a school building that get to have that perspective.
Yeah.
And I really love to nail on this point that, for the teacher, there's a myriad of choices and decisions that they're making daily in a classroom, that they're not able to see all the instruction moves that they have done. And what a privilege as a principal, a AP, a coach, an observer to be able to be that additional set of eyes or hands to say, oh, wow, this was really excellent. And I want to make sure that all of our ELA teachers are doing a similar protocol.
Yeah.
Or in math, that's a great way of discussing a word problem. We need to make sure that that is scalable across all of our teachers. So it's imperative, really, for the administrator to um, have this kind of collection of information and be able to share it broadly to staff.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that habit stacking, taking that. I think that's a key in all aspects really of our leadership is start small, add to it as you go. And I think your point is very valid for the whole collection of artifacts and being intentional about those. And also allowing reflection, because I know like within our system, both the teachers and the administrators are able to load artifacts into an observation or into that teacher's file. Um, I really though you hit on something I think that most of the time administrators are focused on the evaluation of that one teacher, but using those artifacts collectively to plan your professional development, to look at over the course of your entire campus or at the district level, what are some of the things that we're seeing and the documentation that we have that can help guide our future planning. So I think that's a very big benefit that expanding that lens and looking at how can this use of documentation and artifacts serve us well. So that was a great takeaway. I'm making a note so that we can share that with our customers as well. So okay, and as far as the leveraging technology, I know, we've got the natives, the technology natives, and then we've got the those that are very skilled at technology. How do you think that could be leveraged in the event that they don't have a platform like evaluation that does all that collection and data analysis for them?
And again, I oscillate in my own work between I guess I'm not quite a digital native, but I think about how do I keep myself organized and, almost akin to the framework. I think about, we have the framework organized into 4 domains. And I would think about that as an organizing way of how do you want to kind of uh, collate information. So I would think a lot about, as we kind of spoke about this higher level understanding of where, teachers are in their practice. I would think about, all right, I might just have a spreadsheet or a Google Doc of here are things I've seen in domain one, here are things I've seen in domain two, domain three, and domain four. And whether that is like a Google Doc or a Word doc, I would just keep a running tab of that, so that, when it comes to March, you have sort of this index of skills, practices, and and it could be as simple as here are strengths that I'm seeing, like here's the delta, and here's the pluses. I think keeping it really simple is the best way so it doesn't overcomplicate what the system is. Um, and I do that for myself, even if I'm asked to go to a school and do walkthroughs and calibrations. I have a very simple graphic organizer that I use. And then I go back and look at my notes and then I compare it to the framework. I
Mhm.
also think that if people are able to have a digitized version of the framework on their Chrome or laptops, always having it mobile is helpful as well. And just in terms of being able to readily pull out. And this goes to, hopefully it doesn't sound too tangential, but I think the more that, let's say, the framework is readily accessible, the more we're going to have conversations about it.
Absolutely.
So, something else that I see that happens a lot is, especially on the teacher side, is we talk a lot about the framework when it's around this topic of it's the end of year summative or it's my formal observation, versus this is something that should be spoken of. The components and domains should be part of a living language in a school culture around professional learning. So, whether that's every teacher has a, at a glance in their classroom, administrators have it somewhere that is accessible in print version or in a digital version. It's, in my perspective, in my experience, we see huge growth when
Mhm.
the framework in itself is used on a daily basis. And I think it's also a reminder, it's a mental reminder for administrators and for teachers to, use academic language like that's in the framework. It is
Yes.
the common language that we all can speak around what are the strengths that we're seeing, what are some of the nudges and some of the adjustments that we need to make. But again, I think keeping it as simple so it doesn't become overbearing or unyieldy is the best advice I could give to an administrator who's trying to find a way of organizing themselves.
Yeah, yeah. And outside, using a platform like evaluation where that's all centralized for you and the ability to have the rubric up when you're scripting and doing that, there is definitely a need for those organizational skills. So great. Well, I think just to kind of recap, if you've got any questions, those of you that are participating, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A section and we'll answer those. But Brian, what I hear you saying as far as, you know, taming that end of the year beast is be organized and intentional with reaching out. This is a great time to send reminders out to teachers to say, hey, why don't you gather some artifacts and either put them in a platform like evaluation or create a structure where they can submit those. And I think sometimes we put artifacts in without any kind of reflection on those artifacts. So I think that's an important either discussion piece or for just documentation and feedback and reflection. So getting those organized, looking ahead at those big buckets and really what you want to focus on with that individual teacher, but also collectively across the campus or from a central office level, looking across the district on what kind of professional development do we need to address the components within the framework and sets the course for next year. Because I think in my history of doing teacher evaluations and being a campus and district leader, it was important to create the plan for next year. This is what I'm seeing, you know, maybe 2.3 and that whole engagement piece in classroom is a focus for our entire campus next year. And I think having access to reports and data help guide that conversation so that you can set yourself up for your beginning of year launch. Here's what we're going to be doing this year, and we're really going to focus on this aspect of instruction, and that serves in the end of the year, but also in planning for the following year. So anyway, I don't see any Q&A. Brian, do you want to add anything before we close out?
Yeah, I'll add two additional things that I think again are, kind of low lift. One would be if folks have Zoom or even Teams using the transcription through when they're having pre and post conversations, because I think there's so much rich dialogue that occurs that, I'm someone that I really like to be very engaged and present when I'm speaking, whether to an administrator, that being able to have a capture of the dialogue is always helpful, and leveraging the technology to do so is great. So then from there you can make next steps or to-dos. So that's another thing I think is very easy to do. Is especially as many teachers as many of our administrators have to meet with, is being able to transcribe it, or simply if you are able to use some type of device to record the conversation. And I don't want to get too much in like the union legality, but whatever is we can work within your school or district, but being able to document that in a way that you're not having to manually type as much, I think is a win. And the second thing would be, as you mentioned, sort of about as administrators are planning for, next year or thinking about their end of year PD or how to wrap up, nomenclature, I think is also something that we have to start using more. So for example, if it's I'm observing for 3A, communicating about purpose and content. My folder is clearly labeled 3A, communicating about purpose and content. Or as I have my teachers submit those documents, they're using similar nomenclature so that we can sort of organize it in a way that is easy to access and pull. And I think, again, not very difficult, and it takes 30 seconds to kind of have those systems and organizing kind of protocols in place.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Really helps with the consistency across the campus to identify. I think it's really also as you're planning for that end of the year surge, making sure that you allow time for those summative evaluations. Block that out to allow for the reflection and looking at artifacts and having that discussion with teachers. I know it gets really hairy with all the things like you mentioned before with the end of the year graduation, all the end of the year festivities, testing. So start planning that calendar now for those conversations with your staff members. That takes a big chunk out of the scramble at the end, because we all know what happens when you're getting to that point. It's just more of a compliance. You just run them through, and that whole reflective practice discussion gets squelched or reduced. So go ahead and start that now. There's probably some of your tenured teachers, you can go ahead and schedule the summative evaluation here in March before testing. You may be waiting on your younger teachers or your first year teachers or those with alternative certifications to do a couple more observations. But I always found it beneficial to the teachers that I didn't have as many concerns about. Go ahead and have those reflective conversations, because the reality is they want feedback too. They don't just want, oh, you're doing great, sign this and be on your way. All educators value that feedback. So being intentional about that is really important. Well, we want to, I know we're coming right up on our time, and we appreciate you setting aside and participating with us. Brian, thank you so much. We'd love to have you on. Your insight and wisdom is definitely a benefit to customers with evaluation, but also educators across the United States. So thank you for all your work and what you're doing with the Danielson Group. And here at Education Advanced, we want to make it easier. So we're a company of educators developing software solutions for educators to save you time and energy, as we discussed today, on just collecting documentation and performing teacher evaluations. So have a great day. Enjoy the end of the year process, and start planning for next year. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us. If you want to learn more about college and career readiness, graduation tracking, teacher growth, assessment coordination, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter. Until next time.